this section. They're not quite done, but I at least want you this part because there's other research and stuff I want to go into before we wrap up this section. But I will work on that over the weekend to get that done. Okay. So let's get into this. All right. Interesting blue streak on our screen. Anyways, so there's some major themes that we need to talk about when we talk about cultural studies and development, okay? Is that when we look across cultures, as long as there's the sufficient nutrients, there's the sufficient ability to grow and develop, we find that across cultures, children develop approximately at the same rate, meaning that children will start to roughly start talking at about the same rate. We see within the first year or so that children triple in size across cultures. We find that around the age of 6, we have about the same vocabulary on average across cultures. But we know that context matters, okay, and the culture that the person comes from matters. And that the way we use things like language and the way we develop and the context in what we develop matters. And so this will probably become more clear when we talk about cognitive development, and we'll use Piaget's model to discuss this. That really what we should look at when we look at things like what quote unquote stage models of development is that children develop cognitively to the context that they live in. Not necessarily we all get to all of this other forms of cognitive development, but we get to the point of where we need to, given the culture and the context in which we live. Okay. So as I mentioned, I want to start with a kind of on parenting practices, because that's really where things begin from a cultural perspective. Once we give birth to a child, they now live in a socio-cultural environment. I've mentioned in this class a couple times that human beings are born with an underdeveloped brain. And because of that, because our brain actually grows between the age of 0 and 6, instead of being developed in the womb and nutrients of the mother's womb, I think I said that twice, in the mother's womb, we are raised mainly, our brain develops mainly in the socio-cultural environment that we exist in. And parents play a large role in our outcomes and how our brain develops, okay? And so there's 3 areas that we look for when we're doing kind of cross-cultural comparisons. The first one is the parenting style, okay? And the one that is the 2 that are most studied are authoritarian versus authoritative parenting styles. Okay. And basically, authoritarian is kind of like, if you want to think about it as a military kind of situation where there's the general and then there's the subordinates who are there to obey the general. If they don't obey, they get punished. If they obey, they get rewarded. But everything is determined by the parent, okay? Versus what we call an authoritative parenting style. This is where things are decided based on a consensus that we take into value what the children want and what the children need. Okay. And I'm going to completely say this up front. Uh, when we look at, for example, the culture here in the United States, it was very much based on authoritarian perspective, where mom and dad were the authority figures and the children were taught to obey. You probably see these memes on Facebook all the time where um, it says, in my generation, if I did something wrong, my parents would spank me and I'd never do it again. Okay. That's an authoritarian mindset. But we're starting to see in American culture an authoritative mindset where the parents are taking the needs and the wants of the children into consideration when it comes to decisions about, what they're going to do, the activities, all those kinds of things. Okay. The problem is, though, is that authoritative ways of parenting work in what's called interdependence cultures versus independent cultures. Okay. So if we go to, for example, Eastern cultures, we're talking India, China, Japan, um, Taiwanese, those kind of Eastern, they tend to be what we call more interdependent cultures, meaning that my successes and failures are a reflection of who I come from, my family, my community, my state. Whereas, and my successes are the same. So it's a shared value between the culture and the individual versus an independent culture where my successes, my failures are mine and only mine, that I'm an independent individual and my successes and failures are mine, if you want to take the term independent of my family and those kinds of things. Here in the United States, we have more of an independent culture. Now, not within all subcultures, but on the majority or on the higher area. No, I don't even want to say higher. On the mainstream culture here in the United States, we tend to be more independent mindseted, okay? And going back to the parenting style, we find that cultures who match independence with um, with the democratic parenting style, that tends to be a successful match. Okay. Um, Authoritative is the proper term for that. But here in the United States, the authoritative approach to parenting combined with the independent culture here in the United States, that doesn't always mix well. And so what we're looking for is that the culture has to shift in both directions. And we find that that tends to be the reason why we see some increases in mental health issues and those kinds of things within our culture, because the parenting style doesn't match the culture we're in. And so that's an example of intracultural issues versus cross-cultural examples. Okay. And we look at general themes, and these are kind of go into what we were just talking about. For example, the parent-child relationship, the activity I want you to engage in will introduce two types of parent-child interactions and their outcome. Discipline practices, whether we use, for example, quote unquote, corporal punishment, such as screaming, yelling, hitting, spanking to the point of injury, all of those types of things, versus where we see in Eastern cultures, it's social isolation, where the child, instead of being physically punished in some way, They are shunned from the parent. The parent basically ignores the child, and then that brings the child into compliance, as you would say. And cultural transmission. How does the parent transmit the cultural expectation to that child? Okay. And so those are the things that we really look at when we look at parenting practices and some of the general themes we look at. And the thing that I want to emphasize at this point, okay, is that we don't look at which cultures are bad and which cultures are good. What we look at is how the parenting style matches the different cultures that we look at. So if you want to think about this, it's kind of an amoral type of perspective that we take. What we're wondering is how does the different cultures respond to growing and developing their children? And so I want to make it clear, we're not making a cultural assumption that there's one culture that is superior to another. We're just wanting to know how does that parent-child interaction influence their development within their environment, their context, and promotes, if you want to put this in evolutionary perspective, how that promotes the survival of that cultural community. Okay. So this is what I would like you to do on the parenting end of our class. Is you'll notice that I did post both chapter 1 and chapter 2 out of the comportment book. I would encourage you to read chapter 1 to provide you with some context of what we're doing. But what I want you to do is I want you to look at two different cultures. The Artama people use a very off parenting style. They ignore the children. They provide very corporal punishment to the children when they're out of line. They don't see children as something unique and special and needs to be nurtured and cared for. Versus the Flukas, who spend a lot of time nurturing their children. They're seen as the prize of their community, the future. And so they're a very nurturing culture, a very want to be there for their children and the like. And so the Artima start at page 21, the Aflukas start at 25. And I want you to think about these questions for when we come back on Monday, okay? One, I want you to think about what are the similarities and the differences between each of these two people, okay? Meaning, what are some of the geographical similarities? What are some of the environmental similarities and differences? What are some of the, kind of mentions this in this, what are some of the cultural differences between the two? And then I want you to think about how each of their culture influences their parenting style. What does culture expect for their people to exist? Okay. And then I want you to think about why these two parenting styles develop based on the differences between environments and people. You'll see that I'll just give an example with the Artima. They have a larger population than the Aflukas, which is right during the time this book was written, there was like 250 of them, and they were stuck on this isolated island. I don't want to say stuck. They existed on this isolated culture. Hold on just a second. Okay. And then the other part of comportment that I find it interesting and kind of gives us a highlight is it does do the cross-cultural comparison, but it does a within cultural comparison about what the culture did before Western introduction of alcohol and after. And so I want you to see, do these different parenting styles affect the drinking habits before and after Westernization? And what are the similar and different results? Okay, so I think you will find this interesting because it gives us both a cross-cultural comparison and a within cultural comparison based on the introduction of different things, such as the introduction of Western um, uh, alcohol. You will note that um, um, despite the myth that alcohol was not introduced until Western or colonialism, that there were actually spirits and alcohols before Western uh, culture. One of the myths behind why Native Americans tend to be alcoholics, which is a myth, I want to say that right now, is because they weren't able to metabolize alcohol as quote unquote well as their European counterparts. And I think you'll see that that is a huge myth based on this literature that you're going to read as far as this. So that's, I know not everybody is into the drug and alcohol world, but I think you will see that a lot of those things that were taught from um, uh, Western colonialized societies are actually false. So that's another reason I kind of want you to read that, because one of the things we need to discuss in this class is when one culture forces its culture onto another group, which is called acculturation. And we'll get to that later in this course. Okay. So that's kind of where we're going to go with the parenting style situation. Right now, what I want to talk about is cognitive development. So how does thought processes and understanding the world on a quote unquote logic basis develop over time with children's development? And we're going to talk about two theories, Piaget, Jean Piaget and Vygotsky. The reason why we're going to focus on these two theories is because they are probably the only two that have been tested across cultures. And we'll learn that with Piaget, that his stage theory is pretty consistent across cultures. And with Vygotsky, we will see that cross cultures, we use this, what he's going to call scaffolding, the building of knowledge across cultures as well. So, but there is differences between cultures about how they'll use the different stages of Piaget and Vygotsky. Okay, but let's get into these really quick. So this is what we mean by a stage model, that from one period of time to the next, we go through a different stage of development. Okay. And this should look familiar if you've taken Psych 101 or if you've taken the Psych 240, Human Growth and Development. But I'm going to go through these stages just briefly to kind of come to an understanding of what Piaget was actually trying to understand when it came to human cognitive development. The thing that I want to warn you about when you're thinking about this model is this. While it does deal with the interaction between the child and their world, this this theory focuses on cognitive development, the ability to think logically, systematically, to think about how the world impacts, to basically adapt to one's environment. Okay. And so I'm going to present it as he presented it originally, and then we're going to go into some qualifications about this model, um, just as a brief kind of summary of what this model is about. I don't want to make this into a Psych 101 or a human development conversation, but I just want to provide some background on this model. Okay. Is what Piaget wanted to know is how do we go from just sensing the world and interacting with the world to understand it, to being able to mentally represent it and manipulate it through abstract thinking and logic and those types of things. How do we get from that basic being able to interact with objects to being able to actually mentally manipulate them? Okay. And what he first developed is this idea of what's called the sensory motor phase of development. Okay. Where it goes from about the age of 0 to 2 years of age, where we're just trying to figure out our body and its motor ability to actually interact with the world. Okay. So in this, and this is why he called it the sensory motor period of development, how we um, understand that I'm in a position in space, and if a bottle is sitting in front of me, as an example, how do I reach out, grasp that bottle, and make it do what it's supposed to do, which in this case is supposed to bring nutrients into the infant's mouth and stomach through the suckling reflex. Okay. And so it really is just the coordination between sensory input and motor response. Okay. What the difference, though, according to Piaget, between stage one and stage two is the ability to hold information in our mind, to be able to symbolize it as an object, thing, or event. Okay. And he believed that this happened when a child develops what he called object permanence. Okay. And to kind of review object permanence, the best kind of research paradigm is if you can imagine a small curtain thing that separates, for example, the experimenter from the child, but the child can still see the experimenter. Okay. And on one side of the curtain is the child's favorite teddy bear. Okay. And either in a verbal way or a nonverbal way, they basically ask the child if they can recognize that bear. Okay. And then in front of the child, the experimenter, sometimes they use the parent because the child is usually more comfortable with the parent. They take the bear in front of the child and put it behind the curtain. And then they ask again to signal, where is the bear? Okay. Now I'm going to put this in verbal terms. Under the age of 2, the child would basically say, "What bear? What are you talking about, dude?" Okay. And but after the age of 2, Piaget recognized that the child was kind of like, "You idiot, you just put it behind the curtain. I just saw you. It exists behind the curtain." Okay. And what is being observed here is that under the age of 2, the child isn't recognizing objects that don't exist within their sensory input. Meaning, if they can't sense it, it doesn't exist. But around the age of 2, we start to symbolize that little bear and realize it exists, even though it's not in our sensory experience. Okay. And this is where we develop what's called symbolic thought, meaning that we start to assign objects in our environment with names and symbols. Okay, so a teddy bear is a teddy bear. A mother is a mother, irregardless if they don't exist within my sensory experience. And so we start to provide symbols. And as I mentioned in human development and in introduction to psychology, between the age of about 2 to 6, at least within our Western culture, um, children learn up to around 50 to 60,000 words between the age of 2 and 6. All of those are symbolization of objects they're identifying in their world. Okay. This stage is also marked by some different aspects due to the symbolization and this increased symbolization of the world. One is irreversibility. This is the inability to recognize that when an object is broken, you can still put it back together. Centration and egocentrism is the idea that I must exist for the world and that no one else really matters in a sense. And if you look at early childhood education here in the United States, these are areas that they really focus on in this age group. So they work on projects where you can take something apart and put it together, such as Legos, and that the relationship between you and others matters. So they spend a lot of time, for example, in childcare, negotiating the conflict that occurs between children and helping them understand that other children, just not you, has feelings and emotions and thoughts. And at least within the Western perspective, or here in the United States, and among other cultures, I shouldn't just say this culture, and that's kind of a misnomer, that then promotes the child to go from stage 2 to stage 3 around the age of 7 to 11. Okay. And this is where we get into what's called the concrete operational stage of development. And what establishes this state is the ability to mentally represent objects and manipulate those objects within their environment. Okay. And this is done through two type of tasks. One is a conservation task, and the other is what we call take in perspective of the other people, or mental rotation task. Okay. In the conservation task, and I'll try and draw it here because I didn't want to get into great detail about it, so you'll have to deal with my drawings. Okay. Is we have two beakers. Let's use this as an example. One is A, and the other one is beaker B. And these beakers are the same size. Let's use this as a mental exercise because I know my drawings are not the same size. And they have the same amount of fluid in the cup, okay, in both of these beakers. And most children, even under the age of 7, will say, yes, they're the same amount. But in front of the child, let's say we dump the beaker B into beaker C, which is a different size. In this case, it's more short and longer cylinder, or maybe it's fatter and shorter, dependent upon the different manipulations we do. And then we ask the child, is the liquid that was in B that is now in C still the same amount as in A? Okay. And we found that children under about the age of 7, at least during Piaget's time, would say, no, it's a different amount. Because maybe in this one, they see that the amount is higher in this smaller but longer beaker. And so they might say that there's more in beaker C. Okay. But after about the age of 7, they start to say, no, it's still the same amount. And they're understanding that even though a mass may change shape, it doesn't change amount. And this is the notion of conservation. Okay. In the second task, let's say this is called the three mountain task, but I like using trees. Let's say in the middle of the table, we have kind of this mountain that is in the middle of a table, a round table. And on one side, we have this tall, slender tree. And on the other side, we have a thicker, maybe shorter tree. Okay. And the child is sitting on this side, and mom or the experimenter is sitting on the other side. And the first thing we ask is, what does the child see? And so they'll say something, well, I see this tall, slender one, I see a hill, and on the other side, there's a shorter, thicker tree. Okay. Now that's basically, what a child's going to report most of the time. Okay. But the trick in this experiment is then what Piaget asked, and we'll say, well, let's use Piaget as the example. They asked the little child, what do I see? What does Piaget see? And what he found is that children under the age of 7 will repeat what they see. They'll say, well, you see this tall, slender tree, and then you see the hill, and then you see the shorter, thicker tree. Okay. Around the age of 7, they'll appropriately say what Piaget is seeing. They'll say, well, you see this thicker tree, and then you see a hill, and then you see the taller, slender tree. Okay. So what is the child able to do at this point? They're able to take that object in their head, understand that a person has a different perspective than they do, and they're able to mentally rotate that table to take on the perspective of another person. So in this situation, we're learning that children tend to be able to categorize. A mass doesn't change based on its shape. And they're able to mentally manipulate objects to take on a different perspective. Okay. So what this suggests is that the children is starting to operate on their environment, if not physically, mentally. Okay. And again, I'll come back to our culture. We're not the only ones that do this, as we will see when we do some cross-cultural comparison. But I'll go to the early childhood education perspective, where we encourage children to really say and take on a different perspective on something. What is your perspective? And what's another way we can think about it? What is another way we can, and it encourages that child to go through that mental operation of understanding that we can take on the perspectives in different ways. Okay. And as we'll see when we look at cross-cultural comparisons, other cultures do this differently. So on Monday, we'll actually look at the Western African and Southern African way of getting children to understand these concepts versus the way we do it in Western culture. So we'll bring up those cultural ways that different cultures encourage this change in mental operation. Okay. And then going along the trajectory, the final stage, according to Piaget, is what's called the formal operations stage. And this is where we start to think in the abstract. The reason why stage 3 is called the concrete stage is, even though we're able to mentally manipulate objects, understand conservation, we're categorizing things into different categories. And this is where you start to see what's called black and white thinking, that there's villains and there's heroes, there's cops and there's felons. There's good, there's evil. And if we want to think about this on cultural values levels, there's Christians or non-Christians, Muslims, non-Muslims. And those categories cannot overlap each other. Okay, that there's no overlap between those two types of people. Okay. In the formal operations, though, is we start to understand that we live life in the gray. And the best example I have is I know that we represent cops as kind of heroes, but cops can also do bad things. All right. So there's cops who also break the law. In fact, one of the groups that have the largest domestic violence rates are our police departments and our cops, as an example. And felons aren't all bad people. And my example of this is when I worked in the prison system. There were women that were there that, yes, did bad things, but also did good things. There was mothers that I observed, or female felons that I observed, that during visitation, they were excellent mothers. They were doing everything right. There were women in there that were high achieving. There was actually an accountant in there that didn't do financial crimes, but was really good at figuring out people's finances. Okay. The point being is, in the formal operation phase, we exist in the world of grayness, that we see that not everything is fixed. Not all law enforcement officers have good qualities and bad qualities. Felons or people in prison have good qualities and bad qualities. And it's an intermix of those things that create the world. And to understand those is important. Okay. So as I mentioned, there is some changes to this model. It's not as important for this class. We're learning that infants actually get object permanence at a much earlier age, dependent upon culture. The ability to get through egocentrism is different between cultures. All of these things can adjust on the age level based on the infant's ability, biological ability to understand these things. The thing that I would emphasize on this is not all cultures make it to stage 4, excuse me. But not all cultures that make it to stage 4 can exist in stage 2. Okay, and let me bring up some examples. Okay, two cultures that are considered quote unquote modern cultures, meaning that they've been industrialized, and they're part of the technology era. And so we're going to take up the US and Germany, which I'm going to represent with a G. Okay, we find that about 80% of people in the United States make it to stage 3, but only 20% actually make it to stage, and I shouldn't say actually, make it to the stage 4. Whereas in Germany, 90% of the individuals there make it to stage 4, and 10% make it to about stage 3. Okay, so we have two cultures that are economically, industrial wise, technology wise, the same. But why is there this difference between these two cultures? Okay, well, if you think about the United States, we live in a world of what quote unquote law and order, meaning that there's right and there's wrong, and the law establishes that. We have a constitution that establishes what a person or a government should be doing and what a government should not be doing. We have court systems and legislative systems that keep that in check. Okay. Germany, on the other hand, says that there's malleability within the law system, that we should take the person's consideration, who they are, how they committed, for example, a crime. And law is adjustable based upon the situation of the individual. Now, that's not to say the United States hasn't changed some, that there is some consideration on sentencing and all of those things. But if you're convicted of something, regardless of your life situation, there's going to be some type of punishment. Whether we think it's fair or not can change. But once you're convicted, you're considered this. If you're not convicted, you're considered this. In Germany, the conviction is irregardless of you're not considered a felon or a non-felon based on the crime, but based upon your actions. Okay. And so that's what we see in the differences between these two stages. And I'll end up right with this one, and I'll use the letter A. Let's talk about some indigenous tribes within the Amazon. Okay. These individuals tend to, when we measure it, make it to stage 2. So does that make these individuals inferior to cultures that make it to stage 3 and 4? The answer is absolutely not. Okay. Because in stage 2, what do you need to be able to do? You need to be able to navigate your environment. You have to be able to symbolize the difference between plants that are good for you, plants that are bad for you, where you need to navigate in order to get from point A to point B, and for survival purpose. This requires symbolizing the world. Now, the only difference is in these worlds, you don't get the centrism and the egocentrism. So we need to take that out of this equation, because these are more interdependent cultures, not independent cultures. And so this is the only difference when we measure these different areas on cultural differences. Okay, these are very Western events that occur based on culture. But here is what makes these individuals successful given their environment. Is if you think about these two cultures, and when they want to go explore the Amazonian culture, what do they need in order to do that? Well, they need GPS, they need tents, they need navigation systems, they need to bring their own food, their own water, their own resources, their own thing. And usually they also have a guide from one of these Amazon tribes that live there, meaning that these individuals, because they're in this concrete formal operation phase, could not just go to the Amazon and survive. They couldn't just go there and be successful. It takes these individuals at this unique environmental contingency development level that makes them successful within that environment. Okay. And I just noticed, I was hoping to finish this earlier, but I just noticed that we're out of time. So I'm going to escape out of here. Let me stop sharing real